Hi everybody, this is Katje and I welcome you to my YouTube channel this evening. That was a song by a flock of seagulls called Space Age Love Song. It's actually my favorite song by the band. They recorded a more popular song, and many of you probably know, called I Ran, So Far Away. That's also a really good song, but there's something very wistful about Space Age Love Song that really appeals to me. So I just wanted to play that for you. And this evening I wanted to make a short video about the issue of identity, human identity, and some of the various issues or questions that come up in connection with the issue of human identity. So I think that what I want to do is just make a few distinctions to begin with, and then I'd like to make a point that I think probably needs to be made, and maybe it will be helpful to some of you who are thinking about these questions. So when we talk about human identity, we might have several different things in mind. And one thing we might have in mind is, well, what makes something a particular human individual, and what is it that makes it the same human individual over time? So this is identity, not in a strict logical sense of identity, but identity is continuity over time. So what is it that makes me the same individual today that, say, I was 20 or 10 years ago or whatever? Is it because I have the same body that I had back then, so there's a continuity of body? Or maybe it's because I have the same soul that I had when I was 20 years ago or 15 years ago. What is it that explains why that individual back then is the same individual that is here today? And is there any good answer to that question? So that's a very philosophical, kind of an abstract issue that a lot has been written about that over the years. So I'm not really going to discuss that this evening. But another issue that comes up in connection with human identity would be some of the things that we would associate with a more psychological notion of identity. So this has to do with things like gender. What is your gender? Maybe your gender does not match the sexual organs, or the sex organs that you have, the sex that you were assigned at birth. Maybe that's different, in which case you're a transgender person or a transsexual person. So there are all kinds of questions about identity, psychological questions about identity that have to do with that. Also, what are your particular psychological attributes? Are you a moody person? Or are you someone who is very outgoing? Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? And what should you do about that? So there are questions, psychological questions about identity as well. But I guess the question that I want to talk about a little bit tonight in connection with identity is, well, what about selfhood? What makes someone into a particular self? That is a very distinctive, not just a human individual who happens to be, numerically different from other human individuals, not just somebody who has certain psychological propensities, a certain gender, and certain other kinds of psychological characteristics, a personality, let's say, a definite kind of personality. Not that, but what makes you a self, a very distinctive human individual who takes up whatever psychological characteristics you have and uses that to become a definite self in the world, so that other people can say, I know who that is. That's a very specific person. That's a very specific self. What is selfhood? Now, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think one thing that's important is, in order to become a self, I don't think that selfhood is something that's given at the outset. All of us are given, say, a certain kind of, a sex, a biological sex, and then maybe there are other things about us, like our personalities or our gender, that are given. that we have to come to terms with. We have to decide whether that we're going to accept that, or are we going to try to conceal it, or try to be something that we're not. Those are all very important questions. But I also think that in order to become a self, in this full, richest sense of becoming a self, I think that's something you have to do. That's something that it's a project or a commitment that you have to undertake in order to organize all of these various other things that you are given, like your sex, or your physical constitution, or your gender, or your personality. How do you take all of those things and create a self? So again, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think that there's one thing that is important, and I think this is maybe relevant to younger people today, especially in the society that we're living in, that can be very confusing sometimes and rather bewildering. I think that when you're young, it's important, one very important step to becoming a self in the sort of richest, most full-blown sense of selfhood that I just described, is it's important to commit yourself to something and stick with it. Something that really excites you, something that really energizes you, that makes you want to get up in the morning and devote your life to it. And it doesn't have to be something that you stick with your entire life, but when you're young, when you're 18, 19, 20, into your 20s, into your mid-20s and even late 20s, it's important to have something like that, a commitment that you can really throw yourself into, and then you'll find that yourself really will begin to emerge. So let me give some different examples of that where people don't do that, and then maybe an example from my own life where I think it was something that helped me become a self. So often today, I've come across several young people in their early 20s, let's say, who are very, very talented people, who are extremely intelligent and very gifted, very attractive, but they don't really seem to be anybody in particular yet, because they don't really seem to be committed to anything that really excites them. They may be interested. I'm not just talking about an interest or a hobby or something that you feel drawn to occasionally. I'm talking about a commitment, something that you can throw yourself into completely and really spend most of your life devoted to pursuing that project. So I know that, for example, there is a transgender woman who's an acquaintance, a friend of mine, and I feel that she doesn't really have a commitment to anything in particular. I think that there's certain interests she has, and she seems to be drawn to this and is thinking about doing it, but I don't really get the sense that she's throwing herself into it wholeheartedly, and so she's kind of drifting. She's kind of just floating along, drifting along, and nothing is really happening yet to focus who she is, focus her into a particular self. I think that could happen, but it isn't happening yet. There's another, and then there are other people like that. I don't want to get into specifics. I'm not going to mention names or anything like that. But I know I can see the result of that in someone who is slightly older. We're talking about somebody now who's getting into her 30s, who was has been where this other person is without any kind of definite commitment, and now it's getting late. Now she doesn't really know what to do with her life, and she's kind of bouncing from one job to another, doesn't seem particularly satisfied. I fear that is a consequence of the fact that when she was younger, she never really threw herself into a particular commitment and just really devoted all of her energy to that. And the older you get, the more difficult it will be to do that. So in conclusion, let me say just a little something from my personal experience. When I was young, in my early 20s, mid-20s, in that point of my life, I really was throwing myself into becoming a philosopher. So I wanted to get my doctorate in philosophy, which I eventually did, and my plan was to go somewhere, get a teaching position, a tenure-track position, and then spend the rest of my life as a philosopher, teaching philosophy, writing papers and books and things like that. And I threw myself from the time I was about 18 on up to when I was about 26 or 27, I really threw myself, even beyond that, I threw myself into that project wholeheartedly. There was really very little else that I was doing. I mean, I had friends, and I had some romantic interests and things like that, and I eventually met the person that I married. But in my professional career, I was really throwing myself into that project to become a professional philosopher. Now, as things turned out, I never got a job in that. I never became a professor at a university, and for a while, I left philosophy. I didn't do it, for many years, for several years, until I came back to it later in life. And now, I have done quite a bit of work in that area. I have written books in my other life. When I'm presenting as a male instead of as a female, I have written books and papers, and I've had a certain measure of scholarly success in that field. So the point is, to make a long story short, the point is that if I had not undertaken that commitment early when I was in my late teens, early and mid-20s, then even though I would never have been able to come back and do what I did. As it turns out, things didn't proceed there exactly as I had planned, but I'm glad that I made the commitment earlier, because if I hadn't done that, then I wouldn't have been able to come back to it later, or maybe something else would have grown out of it that wouldn't have been exactly like my original commitment. But sometimes you need to throw yourself into something, especially when you're young, so that later that might evolve into something else that you might not be able to predict or expect, but it will enrich your life and it will enable you to become a self in the full-blown sense of that term. Not just a particular human individual, not just somebody who has a certain personality or a certain gender, certain kinds of psychological characteristics, but a self, a definite self who has emerged as such by undertaking a particular commitment and sticking with it. So I would just, as a piece of friendly advice, I would encourage all of you who are really interested in the issue of identity and in the question of selfhood, maybe to think about a little bit about what I said, and hopefully you will find that useful as you continue with your life. Someday I would like to I can imagine having a colloquium where I would, first half of the colloquium, I would come forward in my male self and sort of present a position, and then I would have a break, and then I would come back as Katje and maybe disagree with that person and have a debate with myself, coming at it from two sides. But that's just kind of a humorous fantasy. I don't even really plan to do it. The most important thing, though, is that part of becoming a self in the full sense of that term is undertaking a particular commitment, throwing yourself into it, and sticking with that commitment, and being flexible enough to let it change, but at least in the interim, initially, to stick with it and try to do the best you can to bring it to fruition. So that's all I have to say tonight. Thank you for joining me, and until next time, this is Katje Eckhart. I wish everybody a restful and a relaxing evening. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight. Bye-bye.